Thank you for taking the time to come and to watch this presentation. I appreciate that very much. The comments will be set to review. They will not be posted immediately. And the reason is that this can be an emotional topic for some, and they may be tempted to post inappropriate comments. And so I'd like to spare people dealing with that. I would appreciate those of you who don't agree with what I'm saying to, instead of posting nasty comments, post why you disagree with me or post what you have issues with. I'd be happy to answer comments and questions that are posted. I'll try to do my best to get back to you on those. But do it in an appropriate way, and I will respond in kind. And I would thank you, all those who take the time to put comments. I would appreciate that, and I thank you in advance. I want to make sure that I had the truth with regards to what Darwin taught. For years I read what other people said Darwin taught, but I wasn't sure if that's exactly what he did teach. And since my goal was to make sure that the information I'm presenting to you is accurate, I decided to read his book. And it was very interesting because what he taught in his book is different than what I'd read from other people. What they said Darwin taught didn't exactly line up with what his book said. So that was rather interesting. Now, my goal is to give you information, not to persuade you, not to convince you of something, because what I can convince you into, someone can convince you out of. So, I hope that this presentation and the information contained in it will stir up an interest on your part to do further research. If this is not convincing to you, if the information is not convincing enough, that then you go further and you study more and you research more until you are convinced in your own heart what is true. I will have 3 resources at the end of the presentation, and I will also have them down below in the description section. There will be links to these 3 resources. I've chosen only 3. They're, I believe, very trustworthy, very reliable. I'm familiar with them, and that's why I've chosen these 3. There may be others out there that are good. I'm just not familiar with them. It would take time for me to try to find out whether I can trust them. I already have some amazing resources that I believe will probably give you pretty much everything you need to know with regard to this whole topic. Let's see. So, I start out by examining the foundation on which Darwinism was built. And again, reading Darwin's book was part of figuring out what the foundation is. That's important to me because I believe that determining what the foundation of an idea is helps us decide whether or not that idea is something we should believe in, something that we should accept. So, just be careful. Make sure that the information that you're getting is accurate. There are a number, and I'll probably talk about this more at the end. There are lots of resources out there, procreation resources that are well-meaning, but some of them they haven't kept up to date, or they haven't fully understood the material that they were presenting, or whatever. So just be careful. And I did use pro-Darwin resources to try to verify or examine further the information that I was getting from other resources, because I want to make sure that, again, that I've got an accurate picture of things. So, without further ado, we're going to begin the presentation. So, evolution versus creation. Which one has the most proof? Which one can we know? Which one makes the most sense? I will compare evolution versus design, and I believe then that when we discover, if we discover there's evidence of design, that means there's a designer, and ultimately I believe that means there's a creator. I'm familiar with intelligent design, but that's not what I'm talking about here. I believe that creation is the correct thing to evaluate against when you're considering evolution or something else. I believe creation is the right thing to look at. So, again, is there a designer? Then there's got to be a creator. That's the way it has to work. And I believe that if we see evidence for design, then we have a conclusion that we can make. So, and this next part gets into the foundation on which evolution is built, because evolution is naturalistic / materialistic. That means that a deity or the supernatural has no part in it. The belief is that natural processes produced all that we see. There are those who promote theistic evolution, but I declare that it is a concept without a home. It doesn't fit with the naturalistic philosophy of evolution, and it doesn't align with what the Bible teaches. Furthermore, it will be clear that it's not necessary. Evolution was popularized by Darwin in his book. The idea of evolution has been around since 600 BC. But it was Darwin who brought the idea into the mainstream, and I believe Darwin and his book are the foundation on which modern evolution is built. Now, there are two versions of Darwinism. There's the original as taught by Darwin, and there's something called Neo-Darwinism, or New Darwinism if you wish. And one of the differences between the two is that New Darwinism, Neo-Darwinism, adds things like mutations, includes an understanding of how genetic inheritance works, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So all of this that I'm touching on here has to do with the foundation on which evolution is built, because both Darwinism and Neo-Darwinism are indeed building blocks for that foundation. So, Darwin, what did he believe? He believed that nature was controlling everything and building toward a particular plan. It used natural selection to accomplish that by filtering out bad small variations and keeping the good. And I'm going to give you I'm going to give you some excerpts from his book. That's what I wanted to say. If, then, we have under nature variability and a powerful agent always ready to act and select, why should we doubt that variations in any way useful to beings under their excessively complex relations of life would be preserved, accumulated, and inherited? Why, if a man can by patience select variations most useful to himself, should nature fail in selecting variations useful under changing conditions of life to her living products? Right, let's go back to the top one where it's under in bold. If we have under nature. Now, I've already said that Darwin believed that there seemed to be some intelligent entity behind what was happening. And I believe this proves or points to the fact that Darwin believed that nature was that intelligent entity. Now it gets a little bit muddy because he starts kind of linking natural selection and nature in a way that makes me think maybe he's looking at nature and natural selection as the same. But the bottom line is, as you'll see in a moment, Darwin believed that there was something guiding and directing this whole evolutionary process. And let's get down to the next section of underline, and I'm going to read it in a way that makes it probably a little bit easier to understand. Why, if a man can by patience select variations most useful to himself, should nature fail in selecting variations useful to her living products? Sometimes these old authors get kind of wordy, and sometimes it gets harder to understand. So what's he talking about here? Well, he's talking about, actually what he's doing, he's comparing artificial selection, also known as selective breeding, with natural selection. And the first time I read this, I thought, Darwin, man, what on earth are you thinking? Because what he's saying is that nature is on a par with human beings. He thinks that nature can do just as well as human beings when it comes to producing a desired result. That's what he's saying. If man can by patience select variations most useful to himself, should nature fail in doing the same thing? That's what he's saying. So I read that and I thought, boy, don't you have that kind of backward? Because, I'm thinking that nature is not an intelligence and human beings are, but that's not how Darwin saw it. He really thought that there's some intelligence behind what was happening. Next page, a part of this excerpt. What limit can be put to this power, acting during long ages, rigidly scrutinizing the whole constitution, structure, and habits of each creature, favoring the good and rejecting the bad? I can see no limit to this power in slowly and beautifully adapting each form to the most complex relations of life. The theory of natural selection, even if we look no further than this, seems to me in itself to be probable. Let me comment a little bit, and I'll look at natural selection in more depth in a moment. But Darwin was really intrigued by selective breeding, artificial selection. And I believe that his, I don't know if you could call it an obsession, but his interest in artificial selection kind of led him to this idea of natural selection being a very powerful engine for evolution, because he saw what people could do with selective breeding, and he thought, well, look at what nature has accomplished, in his view. And I believe he was really intrigued by that, and he was really taken by that. So, all right, I had other thoughts. I'm going to put them aside for a minute, and we're going to move forward by looking at the first underline in this section. Rigidly scrutinizing. Now, in order for something to scrutinize something, we have to notice it, we have to want to know more about it, and in other words, it requires some level of intelligence to scrutinize something. And of course he's saying nature is rigidly scrutinizing, being very careful, very intent, very intentional in the scrutinizing. Then we go down to the next underline. I can see no limit to this power in slowly and beautifully adapting each form to the most complex relations of life. Now, I am a jack of all trades, and I guess you could say have been known to cobble things together sometimes. If I need something to make something work, sometimes I'll make what I want. Maybe it wasn't designed for the purpose that I'm going to use it for, but I'll make it work so I can accomplish my goal, whatever it is I'm trying to do. So I know about adapting. I understand what that means. You take this thing and you make it work differently than maybe it was originally planned to work, and you make it function in a way that meets your needs. Again, that says to me there's some intelligence being, Darwin thinks there's some intelligence involved here, and this text, I believe, highlights that fact. Beautifully adapting the most complex relations of life. Darwin spent 20 years looking at living things, and he was really impressed, especially when he went down south on that ship voyage he took. You get into the tropics, it's amazing what you see down there. And so he was really, really impressed by what nature had accomplished. But did it. So, we're going to look at natural selection. First thing I've got to mention is it does not equal evolution. It doesn't. Scientists have been challenged on this, and they hemmed and hawed, and then they finally said, oh, okay, it doesn't really equal evolution. But the two are intimately linked. Not so much. Cannot select for small changes, but must be large life and death changes. Must involve survival. It wasn't all that long ago that scientists actually discovered that natural selection is much more limited than originally thought. Now, there are those who have said, well, your criticisms of natural selection, they're not good, because, well, there's all these helper programs that will enable natural selection, to accomplish what it needs to accomplish. Well, I looked at, there were at least 4 that this one website was promoting, and there may be more. But I looked at these 4, and I've got to be honest, and there's 2 that I remember. There's a genetic drift and migration. None of those help make the shortcomings of natural selection any better. They do not fix the problem of natural selection. And its inability to select for small changes, it's not possible. Natural selection, what little it can select, can only select something that exists. You can't, well, let me back up. Make sure I don't get ahead of myself here. Yeah, I'm going to go to the next thing, because this is where I want to highlight it. It cannot add something new to what exists. This is important. So these 2 kind of go together. Cannot select what exists, or can only select what exists. Cannot add something new to what exists. This is critical, because in order for evolution to function, it has to have the ability to add brand new genetic information to whatever living thing is trying to evolve. It has to be able to do that. So let's use an example that Darwinists like very much, or it's an idea they like very much, let's put it that way. They think that small dinosaurs evolved into birds. Well, let's think about that for a moment. Does the dinosaur, whatever size he might be, does he have any of the characteristics of a bird? No, he doesn't. He doesn't have feathers, he doesn't have the hollow bones, he doesn't have the special lungs, he doesn't have the structure in the shoulders that birds have, doesn't have a beak, and all the other things that make a bird a bird. The little dinosaur has none of those features. He doesn't have any of that genetic information. In order for a dinosaur to become a bird, it needs that new genetic information. There's a lot of genetic information involved there. I mean, just looking at the feathers, you've got flight feathers, but there are at least 3 different types of flight feathers. There's the leading edge, the middle of the wing, and then the trailing edge. There's probably more, I don't know. Yeah, and they're different sizes as you go out the wing. Then you've got the feathers that go on the body, and the feathers that go around the eyes and around the head. And there's a lot of different pieces, types of feathers that are on this bird. Each of them requires their own genetic information. There's a lot of information that has to be there in order for a dinosaur to become a bird. And I just thought of this recently. The dinosaur information, the genetic information that defines a small dinosaur, has to go away. How did that happen? If you think about what selective breeders do, their goal is to make sure that the thing that they're breeding for breeds true. That's their goal. They want the offspring of whatever it is they're trying to produce. They want the offspring to look like the parent that they finally wind up with. That's why we have Dalmatians with spots, and then their offspring all have spots. And they don't wind up with stripes, they don't wind up with patchy colors, they're always black and white. That happened because the breeder made sure that that genetic information for all those other variations was eliminated. And that's what we'd have to do with a dinosaur. It'd be kind of upsetting for mama bird to give birth, the eggs hatch, and one of them's a dinosaur. That would not be good. So, that's a problem. Natural selection, just like selective breeding, tends to remove information then add it. And as I was just saying, when a breeder works to produce a particular type of animal or plant, he tries to make very sure that the genetic information that he doesn't want is eliminated. And the same thing's going to happen with natural selection. Let's see here. And, of course, all forms of selection are limited by DNA. And that's kind of that's what I've been talking about. The information stored in DNA, it's the blueprint for the living thing it's a part of. And in order for that living thing to change and become something else, that information has to change. New information has to be added, old information needs to be removed. DNA says you can't do this if the information isn't there. Readers know about this because they talk about hitting the wall. They try to accomplish something, they try to produce a particular feature and they discover they can't do it. Well, the reason they can't is because the genetic information is not there. One example is the sugar beet, I believe it is. Started out with about 7% sugar content. They decided that'd be nice to have a sugar beet that was sweeter than that. And so they went and they worked and they worked and they worked and they got it up to 15% and they couldn't go any further. They hit the wall. Why? Because the information, the genetic information necessary for a higher sugar content was simply not there. So DNA is just, it's like the warden. You're not getting out. You're not going beyond this point. You can't make something different if DNA says no. And the only way the DNA won't say no is if you add a lot of brand new information to something. And then finally, the small variations. Because Darwin, when we're talking about what Darwin believed, we talked about the good small variations and the bad small variations and filtering out the bad and keeping the good. Well, what's rather interesting is that Darwin didn't know where those small variations came from. He had no idea. But he was fairly sure that it came from, that it was involving evolution in some way. So, what are they? Well, Darwin, well actually let me, before I dive ahead, Darwin spent, like I said, 20 some odd years and he was examining, living things, and he noticed that there's frequently differences between the parent and the offspring, parents and the offspring. And that small variation between the parents and the offspring is what he's talking about when he says small variations. He did not know what we now know. They were genetic inheritance in action. So bottom line, basically, well, let's review. Nature is not an intelligent agent planning and controlling the future of all living things. It just isn't. Natural selection cannot cause living things to evolve. Those small variations are not evolution. There is nothing here that has anything to do with evolution. Now this is supposed to be the foundation on which evolution is built. But there's nothing here that has anything to do with evolution. None of this stuff points to evolution having anything to do with any of the things that Darwin believed. It just plain was wrong. Now some of you might be saying, okay, well what about mutations? What about neo-Darwinism? Didn't that change things? Well, let's talk about that. Darwin didn't know about mutations, first of all. He had no idea that they existed. The idea of mutations was actually came from a guy by the name of Hugo de Vries in 1900. Darwin's first book came out, I believe, in 1859. And Darwin wasn't around in 1900. He passed away before that. So Darwin had no idea about mutations. It was not his idea. He did not come up with this. It was someone else's idea. So 1900 was kind of a busy year. Hugo de Vries came up with the mutations idea. Hugo and some other scientists rediscovered what a monk by the name of Mendel had already discovered it back in 1866. Mendel discovered the real explanation regarding how genetic inheritance works. Unfortunately, in 1866, his ideas were rejected. Everybody said that, Mendel, you're wrong. Well, in 1900, Hugo and a number of other scientists rediscovered the truth. And the fact that we have this phrase, Mendelian inheritance, today, means that they at least gave Mendel credit for having been right and having found this, figured this out before they did. Now, I believe that Hugo was rather distressed by this, because I think he was smart enough to see what this would do to Darwin's ideas regarding evolution. And the reason he'd be distressed about this, well, there's a couple of things. Number one, Hugo was a big fan of evolution. He really liked the idea. Number two, in 1900, there were various newspaper articles being written about the death of evolution. One came right out and said evolution is dead. So you can see that Hugo was probably less than thrilled when he realized what this discovery would do to his beloved idea of evolution. I believe that he was looking for some way to save it. And so he started out by experimenting with some evening primrose flowers he'd gotten from a field somewhere. He declared that he'd created a new species of flower by way of mutations. He was wrong. The changes in that flower were the result of extra chromosomes, not mutations. The bottom line is, there is no foundation behind the idea of mutations producing new species. Now, mutations, okay. All right, so I lost track of my thought. Give me a moment here. Okay. All right, so now the claim is that mutations are the source of these small variations or the small changes. You see, Darwin did not have an explanation for the small variations that he thought were evolution in action. But now it appears, Hugo was really hoping people would start thinking that mutations were the source of the small variations, the small changes, as they're now called, and that it would save the idea of evolution. Now, everybody didn't immediately say, oh, Hugo, you're right. It took time for people to accept that, but once they did, I believe that idea is what saved evolution, unfortunately. As early as 1948, scientists were saying that Hugo had gotten it wrong, that indeed he had not created a new species, and it was not the result of mutations. And yet, here we are, still talking about mutations. Now, mutations are random natural processes. Random. They don't have intelligence. They don't have anything guiding or directing them. So let's look at this next slide. This is an example of what randomness looks like. I used an internet resource to create random numbers. Then I converted the numbers to letters. I thought it'd be easier to see randomness if we were looking at letters. I used 1 equals A and 2 equals B for the lowercase, and capital A equals 27, and capital B equals 28, and so on for the capitals, and 0 equals spacing, which is why this is not even. Now, let's talk about how useful this is. If I had found a piece of software that would allow me to generate my slides using random processes, would I even bother showing them to you? Would they be of any value? Would they present any useful information? No. I mean, there's nothing here. Random processes are going to give you this, or this, depending on where I put my slide window. This has no intelligence behind it. It's random. And as you can see, it's not useful. You poke through there and you might see a word here and there, Usually it's got a capital where it shouldn't have one. So here we are, we're going to ask the question, can mutations add new information to the DNA of something? Because that is the claim. The claim is that mutations add information, add new genes, because that's what's required, that it adds new genes to DNA. So can random processes create a new location for a new gene? Requires intelligence to do that, so I would say no. Provide a proper format for the information. Well, you saw what the slide looked like with the random information on it. So I'm saying no to that answer too. Put the correct information in the right location. Requires intelligence. You have to know where the information is supposed to go. And you have to know whether or not the information is correct for that location. Requires intelligence. Random processes are not smart. Not at all. Can it properly encode the information so it can be read by the cell? All the information stored in DNA is encrypted, is encoded. And the cell actually has a little machine called a decoder. And the decoder is required before anything can use the information contained in DNA. And what's really fascinating is that a lot of the machines that make DNA usable have their instructions stored in DNA encoded, including the decoder. Now, I don't know how this works. I'm guessing that the decoder has some kind of a bootstrap process that enables it to decode enough information so it then can decode its own instructions, and then it can go on and decode the instructions for the transcribing engines and for the ATP synthase engine, which provides energy for the cell and all this stuff. But mutations, they aren't going to be able to encode this information properly. They can't even produce the right information. Here's what happens with mutations. A mutation comes in, it does something within the DNA, and it affects it in three different ways. Either the change is neutral, the change is slightly positive, or it's destructive. Those are the only three possibilities. And even the mildly positive change that occurs weakens the living thing that it's part of. It's never as strong as the parent if the parent does not have that mutation. Mutations, they just come in, something random happens, they affect the contents of the DNA, and they affect existing information in the DNA. They do not have the ability to create a new location for a new gene and do all the things that are necessary. So this is the foundation on which evolution is built. So now we ask the question, design, is there any evidence to support it? Now, we can start by looking at the eye. Now, to me, the eye is a marvel of engineering. Now, this picture is a very, very, very simple picture of the eye. Excuse me. The eye is much more complex than this, and one of the pictures I'm going to show you will give you some idea of just how much more complex. But this is a good overall view of the eye. Now, there are those who think the eye is poorly designed. They say the eye shows very poor design. They wish to avoid the idea of a designer at all costs. So let's look at the case for a Just So story. The case for the evolution of the eye made by those critics. It starts with a Just So story. A Just So story is an attempt to explain something for which there is no evidence. It is an attempt to fill in the gaps in evolution so they are not so obvious. I think a good way to start a Just So story is, well, there's no scientific evidence for this idea, but it could have happened this way. So here is the Just So story for the eye. First, a light-sensitive spot appears. And then more light-sensitive spots appear. And then somehow, these light-sensitive spots all group together. And then, underneath these spots that are all grouped together, a depression forms. And then this clear membrane forms over the top of them. Well, and there's more, but you get the basic idea. Let me just ask you a question. If I didn't tell you that this was a story about the evolution of the eye, wouldn't you kind of think there was some intelligence involved? I mean, think about it. These spots, these light-sensitive spots, somehow wind up on the proper end of the animal, on the head, not the tail, somewhere. Somehow the spots all come together. Somehow a depression forms under them. Somehow this clear membrane forms over the top of them. And bear in mind that these light-sensitive spots don't need this clear membrane, which is actually contrary to the way evolution works. Supposedly, evolution brings into existence things that are needed. The clear membrane is not needed. And the story continues on, and they say, well, then the clear membrane forms a ball surrounding the light-sensitive spots. Well, there's a problem with that, too, because the light-sensitive spots are facing outward into the light, but the photoreceptors in our eye are facing away from the light. And that, by the way, is why the critics of the eye think the eye is poorly designed, and that the designer of the eye should probably go back to remedial engineering school. I'm kind of paraphrasing there. So the question is, how does the existence of these spots help the living thing they're a part of? Until the sun is out, you can tell when it's dark. Does it help? I don't think so. And they're portrayed as being simple. They're anything but. Dr. Michael Behe says these things would require a dazzling array of biochemicals in the right place and time to function. That doesn't sound so simple. He says that each of its cells makes the complexity of a motorcycle or a television set look paltry. These are not simple. Random processes could not produce them. And that has nothing to do with the changes that are required to the animal's brain to interpret the signals from these light-sensitive spots and the special nerves sending the information to the brain. So this is not simple. So, again, the claim is that the eye is wired stupidly backwards, that the photoreceptors that they believe should be facing toward the front of the eye. So, we're looking at the picture of the eye again. Where the pupil and lens are, the light is coming in, the photoreceptors are to the left, toward the end of the eye where the blood vessels are. The photoreceptors face away from the light coming in. Seems wrong, right? Shouldn't they be facing toward the light? Well, let's find out. George Marshall, the Sir Jules Thorne lecturer in ophthalmic science, explains that the nerves could not go to the back of the eye because that space is reserved for the choroid, which provides the rich blood supply needed to regenerate the photoreceptors and to absorb excess heat. So it is necessary for the nerves to go in front instead. If the photoreceptors did not have this blood supply, it would take a month to get your sight back so you could see well enough to drive after having a flash photo taken. Now also, because blood is opaque, if the photoreceptors were faced around so that they face to the front, and then you've got a layer of blood, which the photoreceptors need, in front of them, you'd be blind. Blood is opaque, light does not go through it, you cannot see through it. The photoreceptors need to have that blood supply. They need to be protected from the heat. How does this work? Well, the final nail in the coffin of the poor design idea. Scientists recently discovered, I think it was around 2007, that our eyes use fiber optic technology. Each photoreceptor has a fiber optic wire called a molar glial cell feeding it. That means the light isn't hindered in any way in getting to the photoreceptors. The light sent to each photoreceptor is shared with the cones and rods that are also at the rear of the eye. I'll show you that in a minute. There's a bell shape at the front of the fiber optic wire. That's an improvement over fiber optics since it increases the amount of light sent to each photoreceptor. So here's that picture. The light's coming down from the top. You see the bell shape there at the top of those two molar glial cells. So that concentrates more light going down the fiber optic wiring. And at the bottom, where you see that area lit up and you got all these things sticking up out of the bottom there, rods and cones and photoreceptors live there. And then the blood supply is also right there. So the problem of the wires, the nerve wires, getting in the way of the light doesn't exist. In fact, if you look between the top of that where the light's coming in and the bottom of that light where the light is hitting the rods and cones, you see the nerve wiring in that space, more up toward the top. You can see that the light is not hindered in any way in getting down to where it's supposed to go. Very, very clever design. Because you have two conflicting things that you have to deal with. The photoreceptors need to face the rear of the eye. They need to be in contact with that rich blood supply. At the same time, they need to have the light coming into the eye available to them. How do you do that? Fiber optic technology. Human beings didn't develop fiber optic technology until somewhere around 1980s, maybe early 1980s. We've always had it. We're way ahead. We didn't know we had it. So, the nerves are not in the way. The photoreceptors don't have to face the front of the eye. The eye is intelligently designed. So, oh, and there's one more thing I want to mention. I almost forgot. Molar glial cells are designed to enhance and sharpen the clarity of vision. Furthermore, the molar glial cells are attuned to the visible region of the spectrum and leak out other wavelengths, minimizing radiation and heat damage. Another amazing design feature of the retina is the signal processing that occurs even before information is transmitted to the brain. For example, a process called edge extraction enhances the recognition of the edges of objects. It would take a minimum of 100 years of Cray supercomputer time to simulate what takes place in your eye many times each second. Think about that. Somewhere in the back of your eye, there is something processing information far faster than a supercomputer can do it before it gets sent to the brain. And then we have this. I've got these two arrows pointing in both directions. Well, little triangles, but those are supposed to be arrows. Because information travels from the brain to the eye, information travels from the eye to the brain. This is a tightly integrated system, very complex, tightly integrated system. If you look at the back of the eye in the orange area, you see that there's two things there having to do with visual association, that says visual. And then up top in the blue area, well, just below the blue area, there's something called the frontal eye field. There's a lot going on here. So the eye's already done some processing of the information, and then it sends it to the brain, where more processing takes place. So you've got the optic nerve connects to a second section of the brain that is able to interpret what you see, since the retina translates light into nerve signals. An eye is useless if what you see can't be understood. The brain must be able to interpret the images it receives. That's essential. When I look at something, I can identify it because my brain has sufficient information to identify it, and my brain is able to process that visual information and make an identification. We've all had the experience, we've all had the experience of looking at something and maybe the angle is funny or the lighting is weird, and at first we're not sure what we're looking at. And we look at it and think about it and look at it, and finally the brain comes up with an answer. Oh yeah, I recognize that. Well, that's possible because our brain was hard at work trying to sift through the information that it stored, that it contained, to identify that thing that we're looking at. And it does, usually, unless it's something we've never seen before. Next, the blood supply of the eye helps deal with heat buildup, and it protects the eye against thermal damage. Blood flow is controlled by the brain and increases with increases in light intensity. Without that protection, the eye would suffer thermal damage much more easily. This is clearly carefully calibrated to provide proper protection. So the Muller cells are designed to prevent the eye from overheating. The blood supply is there to prevent overheating. Wonder why that is. Well, if you've ever taken a magnifying glass and tortured some poor little ants with a hot dot of sunlight, then you have some idea why our eyes need protection. Our eyes have lenses, and the sunlight shining through our lenses could cause problems in the eye and could produce high levels of heat. Our eye is designed and calibrated to protect against that heat. The iris of the eye, we're well aware, gets smaller or larger depending on the amount of light detected by the eye. Again, the eye isn't doing this all by itself. The brain is doing this. The eyes work as a team. Because of the brain, there are no rods connecting the eyes. There are 6 muscles per eye that move the eyes up and down and side to side and allow rolling of the eyes. I picked on the teenagers one time, so that was there so they could roll their eyes, and they told me after the presentation that that was not fair, that adults do it too. I had to admit defeat on that one. The motions of the eye are very sophisticated, and the brain carefully positions the eyes for correct focus depending on whether you're looking at objects close up or far away. This is separate from the focusing of the lens. There's also a certain amount of jitter designed into the system, because without that we wouldn't see clearly, or we wouldn't see at all. If we were able to keep our eyes completely still, we would cease to see anything very shortly, because the brain would edit out what it had already viewed. Now, we all know that something is blinking or flashing or moving catches our attention. I believe it's because of how our whole vision system is designed. Our brain is doing a huge amount of processing, but once it's seen something, it starts looking to see if there's something new. And something that's flashing, something that's moving, is something new, so the brain focuses on that and draws our attention away. Which is why, flashing signs are a great advertising deal, because it's going to get more of our attention, and we're going to look. It's just the way we're wired. The lens is adjusted by the muscles allowing the eye to focus, also controlled by the brain. Again, there has to be a level of calibration here. I mean, we deal with video cameras. I'm looking into one right now. If it did not have an auto-focusing system, we would have to manually focus to get the right, and there are settings on the camera where you could wind up saying, yeah, I want to manually focus this camera. But if some intelligence isn't focusing, making sure the image is clear, it's going to be blurry and it's not going to be very useful. Same thing with our eyes. If our brain is not doing the proper job of making sure that our eyes are properly focused on something, we're not going to see very clearly. Once again, I believe there's a strong case for the design of the eye. And there are other protective mechanisms for the eye, such as the cornea, which is a clear protective covering. Eyelashes and eyebrows are there to aid protecting the eye. The eyelid, tears are lubricants for the eyes and protect it in a variety of ways. So, the question is simple. How did this happen? How did it happen? When you think about the power, the processing power just in your eye, and then you think about what goes on in the brain, and all of this stuff, and the same is true of our hearing, by the way. Our brain, there's an auditory section of our brain that's linked to the mechanisms in our ears so that we can hear. This is complex stuff. It's designed so that it functions properly. If our eyes were not designed, if things were not put together right, our eyes would either not work very well and everything would be blurry, or they'd be destroyed because of the heat coming in through the lens. I mean, there's just a bunch of things that would go wrong without some kind of design involved in the eye. So the question is, how did this incredibly complex integrated system come into existence? It didn't happen as a result of random processes. I don't believe that's even remotely possible. If you talk to an ophthalmologist or you read some of the scientific articles online, I tried doing that once. I discovered that your eyes can cross. That stuff was intense. I'm not a scientist. I do not have the scientific background to understand the technical jargon these guys were using. But one thing I walked away from those articles with was how amazingly complex our vision systems are. And I only just touched on the surface of it. If you really want to look at things more in depth, go to some of these ophthalmology sites and start reading about what happens, how our eyes design, how it works. It's just incredible. So, is the eye designed? I'm pretty sure I can say yes to that one. Pretty confident. I believe the eye is a model of clever engineering. And there are those who are going to deny it, but they can't deny it scientifically. It's just simply their desire to not believe in the fact that there's a designer. So next I want us to look at this. Planet Earth is our habitat. Life here on Earth is possible because a lot of different factors have come together to make it possible. And I could give you a long list of those things. But instead, we're going to look at this. This is an artist rendering of a habitat on Mars. So, say our astronauts arrive at Mars, they land and they see this. They go inside, they see someplace that looks like it's designed for human life. There are tables and chairs in a common area, obviously the cafeteria, or just a common gathering area, and is the right size for human beings. They discover there's sleeping quarters, again there's beds and everything that are designed to fit human beings. They discover the kitchen. It's got all the right appliances. It's got food that humans can eat. Then they find the computer that controls the environment in this habitat. And this computer is controlling and making sure that the oxygen content doesn't get too high, carbon dioxide content doesn't get too high, that trace elements are what they're supposed to be, the moisture content is proper, temperature is proper. And all the things that make it possible for us to breathe air is all being managed by this system, this very complex computer system. Then you go out into the greenhouse area and you discover there's another computer there, and it's keeping that environment appropriate for growing those plants. So the question I have is, what would those astronauts say upon seeing all this? Would they say, it's amazing that this just all just sort of happened to appear here like this. How amazing does that happen? Is that what they're going to say? No. No, they're going to say, wow, who designed this? It's a pretty amazing job. It's perfect for us. Well, guess what? Planet Earth is perfect for us. You can find out all the different ways that our planet and its location in the galaxy, etc., makes it possible for us to be here and to be alive on this planet and to be healthy. So if we could say about that habitat, gee, isn't it an amazing design? I think we can say the same thing about the Earth. So, let's go to this. I believe what we see today, this is in the form of a warning, I guess you could call it. And this is from Michael Crichton. He's a scientist as well as an author. And he says, I believe what we see today is an attempt to squelch debate regarding whether evolution is proven or not by way of consensus. This is this thing called consensus science. Surely it must be true because scientists believe in it, or because most scientists believe in it. That is not what matters. What matters is whether or not it can be supported by proper, reproducible science. Let me go back to the example of Mendel that I touched on earlier in this presentation. Mendel applied his science properly. He came up with the correct explanation for how genetic inheritance worked. His ideas were rejected. Most, if not all, scientists of his day said, Mendel, I'm sorry, you got it wrong. 34 years later, scientists said, oh, I'm sorry, Mendel, you got it right. Consensus science is not science. This doesn't have anything to do with science. When you're dealing with science, you're not dealing with voting, you're not dealing with opinions, you're dealing with the results of valid scientific experiments. And either the experiments pass the test or they don't. And if they pass the test, even if only one scientist believes in it, that's what matters. So let me finish with the resources I mentioned earlier. There are three, as I said. Creation.com, which is Creation Ministries. ICR, which is Institute for Creation Research. Answers in Genesis, that's Ken Ham's group. And these three are ones that I've used and that I like. They're very trustworthy. There are a lot of resources out there, even pro-creation resources out there that are not, shall we say, the best. Sadly, they are maybe misinformed, not up to date. They didn't clearly understand what they were trying to present. Whatever the case may be, they aren't reliable, good resources. These sources, I believe, are trustworthy. Creation.com has something like 30,000 and growing articles and videos available. Don't know how many videos, but they have 30,000 articles. And they range from really in-depth, more technical articles down to articles that are much easier to understand. I'm not a scientist, so some of their articles are a little bit beyond me, but there's a whole bunch of them that are clear and understandable, and I would encourage you to check them out. ICR, their articles tend to be shorter, more succinct, still good. I've used some of them, so it's a good place to also look for articles, and they also have lots of other resources. And then, of course, Answers in Genesis. If you have questions about whether Genesis is an allegory or not, or any of those questions, is Genesis important? Go to Answers in Genesis. And Creation.com and ICR probably also, I know that Creation.com does. Probably all three of these resources have information on Genesis, because Genesis is a key foundation stone for creation. So, be careful with the resources that you use or choose. I've used, my goal was to find the truth, so I've used non-creation resources, pro-Darwin resources, if you will. Because I want to see if the information I was getting over here matches what I get over here. And there are obviously issues where, because the Darwinists don't want to give you certain information, they don't want to accept the truth, if you will, they aren't going to agree. But there are certain things that I was able to use these other sites for. There are matters of fact that would be stated in the creation articles, and I'd go and check elsewhere and see how they line up. And frequently it was good. I was able to get a good comfort level that the information I was getting was accurate and reliable and trustworthy. And I did mention that I was going to tell you what I believe. I started exploring evolution and creation 40 plus years ago. I could probably figure out how long ago that I started doing this, but that's close enough. A long time. And when I first started doing this, the scientific information available to us was not as extensive and not as advanced as it is today. Scientists have come a long, long way in 43 years or whatever, however long it's been that I've been looking at this. And given the information we have available to us today, I am 100% certain that creation is the right answer. To me, you start looking into the information about DNA, look at what random processes cannot do. There's just so much information now, way more than when I started looking into this. And to me, I'm absolutely 100% convinced that creation is the right answer. Now, that's my opinion. I've come to that conclusion because I've done study, I've done the research, I've examined the facts, and so I'm encouraging you to do the same thing. Don't take my word for it. Who am I? I'm just another person. So I've given you some good resources. Please take the time to look into it. You'll learn a whole bunch of stuff, and I think you'll come to the same conclusion I have. Creation is indeed the correct answer, and evolution and theistic evolution are not the right answer. So if you've gotten this far in the presentation, I thank you, and I appreciate you, again, taking the time. And I hope that you take this information, and that you, if you weren't interested in this that much to begin with, I hope it stirs up an interest, and I hope you go on to learn more for yourself. Because I believe we can know the truth now. I don't think there's any question. The information is enough that we can indeed finally find the truth for sure. So again, thank you, and good luck on your search. Thank you.